He must face the hour which approaches him, the biographical and historical hour, just as it is, in its whole world content and apparently senseless contradiction, without weakening the impact of otherness in it. He must hear the message, stark and untransfigured, which is delivered to him out of this hour, presented by this situation, as it arrives. Nor must he translate for himself its wild and crude profaneness into the chastely religious. He must recognize that the question put to him, with which the speech of the situation is fraught, whether it sounds with angels or with devils' tongues, remains God's question to him, of course, without the devils thereby being turned into angels. It is a wondrous. He must face the hour which approaches him, the biographical and historical hour, just as it is, in its whole world content and apparently senseless contradiction, without weakening the impact of otherness in it. He must hear the message, stark and transfigured, which is delivered to him out of this hour, presented by this situation as it arrives. Nor must he translate for himself its wild and crude profaneness into the chastely religious. He must recognize that the question put to him, with which the speech of the situation is fraught, whether it sounds with angels or with devils' tongues, remains God's question to him, of course, without the devils thereby being turned into angels. It is a question wondrously tuned in the wild, crude sound, and he, the single one, must answer by what he does and does not do. He must accept and answer for the hour of the world, of all the world, as that which is given to him, entrusted to him. Reduction is forbidden. You are not at liberty to select what suits you. The whole cruel hour is at stake. The whole claims you, and you must answer him. You must hear the claim, however unharmoniously it strikes your ear, and let no one interfere. Give the answer from the depths, where a breath of what has been breathed and still hovers, and let no one prompt you. This our command, for whose sake the Bible makes its God speak from the very time of creation, defines anew. When it is heard, the relation of the single one to his community. The human person belongs, whether he wants to acknowledge it and take it seriously or not, to the community in which he is born or which he has happened to get into. But he who has realized what destiny means, even if it looks like doom, and what being placed there means, even if it looks like being misplaced, knows too that he must acknowledge it and take it seriously. But then, precisely then, he notes that true membership of a community includes the experience, which changes in many ways, and which can never be definitely formulated, of the boundary of this membership. If the single one, true to the historico-biographical hour, perceives the word, if he grasps the situation of his people, his own situation as a sign and demand upon him, if he does not spare himself and his community before God, then he experiences the boundary. He experiences it in such agony as if the boundary post had pierced his soul. The single one, the man living in responsibility, can carry out his political actions as well, And of course, omissions are also actions. Only from that ground of his being to which the claim of the fearful and kind God, the Lord of history and our Lord, wishes to penetrate. It is obvious that for the man living in community, the ground of personal and essential decision is continually threatened by the fact of so-called collective decisions. I remind you of Kierkegaard's warning, quote, that men are in a crowd either excuses a man of repentance and responsibility, or at all events weakens the single one's responsibility, because the crowd lets the man have only a fragment of responsibility. End quote. But I must put it differently. In practice, in the moment of action, it is only the semblance of a fragment. But afterwards, when your waking dream after midnight, you are dragged before the throne and attacked by the spurned calling to be a single one. It is complete responsibility. It must, of course, be added that the community to which a man belongs does not usually express in a unified and unambiguous way what it considers to be right and what not right in a given situation. It consists of more or less visible groups, which yield to a man interpretations of destiny and of his task which are utterly different, yet all alike claim absolute authenticity. Each knows what benefits the community. Each claims your unreserved complicity for the good of the community. Political decision is generally understood today to mean joining such a group. If this is done, then everything is finally in order. The time of deciding is over. From then on, one has only to share in the group's movements. One no longer stands at the crossroads. One no longer has to choose the right action out of the possible ones. Everything is decided. What you once thought that you had to answer ever anew, situation by situation, for the choice you made is now got rid of. The group has relieved you of your political responsibility. You feel yourself answered for in the group. You are permitted to feel it. The attitude which has just been described means for the man of faith, I wish to speak only of him here, when he encounters it, his fall from faith, without his being inclined to confess it to himself or to admit it. It means his fall in very fact from faith, however loudly and emphatically he continues to confess it, not merely with his lips, but even with his very soul, as it shouts down inmost reality. The relation of faith to the one present being is perverted into semblance and self-deceit, if it is not an all-embracing relation. Religion may agree to be one department of life beside others, which like it are independent and autonomous. It has thereby already perverted the relation of faith. To remove any realm basically from this relation, from its defining power, is to try to remove it from God's defining power, which rules over the relation of faith. To prescribe to the relation of faith that, quote, so far and no further you may define what I have to do, here your power ends and that of the group to which I belong begins, is to address God in precisely the same way. He who does not let his relation of faith be fulfilled in the uncurtailed measure of the life he lives, however much he is capable of at different times, is trying to curtail the fulfillment of God's rule of the world. Certainly, the relation of faith is no book of rules which can be looked up to discover what is to be done now, in this very hour. I experience what God desires of me for this hour, so far as I do experience it not earlier than in the hour. But even then it is not given me to experience it except by answering before God for this hour as my hour, by carrying out the responsibility for it towards Him as much as I can. What has now approached me, the unforeseen, the unforeseeable, is word from Him, a word found in no dictionary, a word that has now become word, and it demands my answer to Him. I give the word of my answer by accomplishing among the actions possible that which seems to my devoted insight to be the right one. With my choice and decision and action, committing or omitting, acting or persevering, I answer the word. However inadequately, yet properly, I answer for my hour. My group cannot relieve me of this responsibility. I must not let it relieve me of it. If I do, I pervert my relation of faith. I cut out of God's realm of power the sphere of my group. But it is not as though the latter did not concern me in my decision. It concerns me tremendously. In my decision, I do not look away from the world. I look at it and into it. Before all I may see in the world to which I have to do justice with my decision, my group to whose welfare I cling, I may before all have to do justice to it, yet not as a thing in itself, but before the face of God. And no program, no tactical resolution, no command can tell me how I, as I decide, have to do justice to my group before the face of God. It may be that I may serve it as the program and resolution and command have laid down. It may be that I have to serve it otherwise. It could even be, if such an unheard of thing were to arise within me in my act of decision, that I might be set in cruel opposition to its success, because I became aware that God's love ordains otherwise. Only one thing matters, that as the situation is presented to me, I expose myself to it as to the word's manifestation to me, to the very ground where hearing passes into being, and that I perceive what is to be perceived and answer it. He who prompts me with such an answer, in such a way as to hinder my perceiving, is the hinderer. Let him be, for the rest, who he will. I do not in the least mean that a man must fetch the answer alone and unadvised out of his breast. Nothing of the sort is meant. How should the direction of those at the head of my group not enter essentially into the substance out of which the decision is smelted? But the direction must not be substituted for the decision. No substitute is accepted. He who has master may yield himself, his bodily person, to him, but not his responsibility. He must find his way to that responsibility, armed with all the ought that has been forged in the group, but exposed to destiny, so that in the demanding moment all armor falls away from him. He may even hold firm with all his force to the interest of the group, till in the last confrontation with a reality, a finger, hardly to be perceived, yet never to be neglected, touches it. It is not the finger of God, to be sure. We are not permitted to expect that, and therefore there is not the slightest assurance that our decision is right in any way, but a personal way. God tenders me the situation to which I have to answer, but I have not to expect that He should tender me anything of my answer. Certainly in my answering I am given into the power of His grace, but I cannot measure heaven's share in it, and even the most blissful sense of grace can deceive. The finger I speak of is just that of the conscience, but not of the routine conscience, which is to be used, is being used, and worn out, the play on the surface conscience, with whose discrediting they thought to have abolished the actuality of man's positive answer. I point to the unknown conscience in the ground of being, which needs to be discovered ever anew, the conscience of the spark. For the genuine spark is effective also in the single composure of each genuine decision. The certainty produced by this conscience is of course only a personal certainty. It is an uncertain certainty. But what is here called person is the very person who is addressed and who answers. I say, therefore, that the single one, that is, the man living in responsibility, can make even his political decisions properly only from that ground of his being at which he is aware of the event as divine speech to him. And if he lets the awareness of this ground be strangled by his group, he is refusing to give God an actual reply. What I am speaking of has nothing to do with individualism. I do not consider the individual to be either the starting point or the goal of the human world. But I consider the human person to be the irremovable central place of the struggle between the world's movement away from God and its movement towards God. This struggle takes place today to an uncannily large extent in the realm of public life. Of course, not between group and group, but within each group. Yet the decisive battles of this realm as well are fought in the depth, in the ground or the groundlessness of the person. Our age is intent on escaping from the demanding, ever anew, of such an obligation of responsibility by flight into a protective once for all. The last generation's intoxication with freedom has been followed by the present generation's craze for bondage. The untruth of intoxication has been followed by the untruth of hysteria. He alone is true to the one present being, who knows he is bound to his place, and just there free for his proper responsibility. Only those who are bound and free in this way can still produce what can truly be called community. Yet even today the believing man, if he clings to a thing that is presented in a group, can do right to join it. But belonging to it, he must remain submissive with his whole life, therefore with his group life as well, to the one who is his Lord. His responsible decision will thus at times be opposed to, say, a tactical decision of his group. At times he will be moved to carry the fight for the truth, the human, uncertain truth, which is brought forward by his deep conscience, into the group itself, and thereby establish or strengthen an inner front in it. This can be more important for the future of our world than all fronts that are drawn today between groups and between associations of groups. For this front, if it is everywhere upright and strong, may run as a secret unity across all groups. What the right is can be experienced by none of the groups of today, except through men who belong to them, staking their own souls to experience it, and then revealing it, however bitter it may be, to their companions, charitably if it may be, cruelly if it must be. Into this fiery furnace the group plunges time and again, or it dies in inward death. And if one still asks if one may be certain of finding what is right on this steep path, once again the answer is no. There is no certainty. There is only a chance, but there is no other. The risk does not ensure the truth for us, but it, and it alone, leads us to where the breath of truth is to be felt. All right, that is the end of the section called The Responsibility of the Single One, or The Single One in Responsibility. It can be found in Martin Buber's Between Man and Man. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Take care.